Last summer, my fiancée Claire and I decided to take a camping trip to northern Georgia. It was late June, the kind of summer heat that sticks to your skin even in the shade, but we were looking forward to the break from the city. I was 28, and Claire had just turned 27. We'd been together for 5 years, engaged for one, and camping trips had become something of a tradition for us. We loved the quiet, the escape, the simplicity of it all. This time, we set up camp near a lake in a state park we hadn't been to before, about an hour from where we lived in Atlanta. We arrived mid-afternoon, found a cozy spot not too far from the water, and pitched our tent. The sun filtered through the tall pines as we unpacked the cooler and set up a couple of foldable chairs. Claire took charge of the fire while I fiddled with the portable grill we'd brought along. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, just the two of us, no distractions. That evening, we started grilling some burgers. The scent of meat sizzling over the flames mixed with the pine and dirt around us, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. Claire was pouring us drinks from a thermos when we heard it. A man yelling, loud and desperate, "Help! Somebody! Please help!" I froze for a second, the sound jolting me out of my calm. Claire and I exchanged a glance. Her eyes were wide, but neither of us hesitated. I grabbed a flashlight and took off in the direction of the screams, Claire close behind me. It wasn't dark yet, but the sun was dipping low, and the shadows in the trees were starting to stretch out like long fingers. A few campsites over, we found him. A man, maybe mid-40s, standing near a picnic table, his leg drenched in blood. The pool around his feet was growing, dark red and thick. I'm not great with blood. I've always been squeamish, but this was something else entirely. It was like a horror movie come to life. He was swaying, clearly drunk, and shouting incoherently. His face was pale, almost gray, and I could see his hands trembling as he tried to press something against his ankle. The cut wasn't small, it was a deep gash on the inside of his right leg, just above the ankle. I could see the blood spurting in rhythm with his heartbeat. It didn't take a doctor to know he'd nicked an artery. "Jesus!" I muttered under my breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire was already at his side, grabbing a shirt from the ground to press against the wound. She had always been the calm one in emergencies. I, on the other hand, felt my stomach twist. "Keep pressure on it," Claire said firmly, her voice cutting through the panic. "Elevate it." I nodded and ran back to our campsite to grab my phone. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to unlock it, but when I saw the dreaded "no service" in the corner of the screen, my heart sank. I tried again, moving a few feet one way, then another, holding the phone up like some desperate signal seeker, but it was useless. I sprinted back to where Claire was. "No signal," I said, out of breath. She didn't even look up, too focused on keeping the pressure steady. The man was groaning now, his head lolling slightly. He wasn't making sense. Slurred words and half-finished sentences. "There's a hospital about 15 miles out," Claire said, glancing at me. "We need to get him there now." My gut clenched. Blood, drunk strangers, adrenaline. It was all hitting me at once, but I nodded. "Okay, let's get him in his truck." The man mumbled something about his keys, gesturing vaguely toward a nearby picnic table. I grabbed them, helped him into the passenger seat of his beat-up Chevy, and climbed into the driver's seat. Claire stayed behind to keep an eye on his campsite and his dog, a scruffy mutt that had been barking like crazy but now sat quietly near the fire. As I started the truck, I realized how badly my hands were shaking. The smell of blood filled the cab, metallic and sharp. I glanced at the man. His head was tilted back, his eyes fluttering, and his leg was propped up awkwardly on the dashboard, still wrapped in the blood-soaked shirt Claire had used. "Stay with me," I muttered, my voice cracking. I floored it, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The road was winding and dark, the headlights barely cutting through the dense woods. I kept checking the clock on the dash, calculating every second. The hospital was supposed to be 15 miles away, but I drove like my life or his depended on it. And maybe it did. The man's breathing was shallow now, and his speech was slurred beyond recognition. I tried not to look at his leg, but the blood was everywhere, on the seat, the floor, even smeared on my arm from where I'd helped him into the truck. My stomach churned, but I couldn't stop. Pure adrenaline kept me focused. I pulled into the hospital parking lot in what felt like record time, 12 minutes, maybe less. As I threw the truck into park, the man's head lolled to the side, and I wasn't sure if he was conscious anymore. I ran inside, yelling for help. Nurses and doctors came rushing out with a gurney, and they lifted him out of the truck. Blood spilled onto the pavement, pooling beneath the open door. I watched as they wheeled him away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I sat on a bench outside for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. My clothes were sticky with sweat and speckled with blood, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't until Claire arrived in our car, about half an hour later, that I felt like I could breathe again. We drove back to the campsite in silence, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy between us. The man's dog was still there, waiting faithfully by the fire. We fed him some scraps from our cooler and tried to salvage the evening, but it was hard to shake the image of all that blood. I kept replaying the drive in my head, wondering if I'd done everything right, if there was something more I could have done. Around 10:30 that night, just as we were starting to settle down, we heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading to our site. It was the man, limping slightly but alive. He had a bandage wrapped tightly around his ankle and a hospital bracelet on his wrist. 18 stitches, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Doctor said if y'all hadn't been there, I'd be dead. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He stayed for a while, sitting by the fire with his dog curled up at his feet. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. Eventually, he thanked us again and made his way back to his campsite. That night, as I lay in the tent next to Claire, I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted but restless. I kept thinking about how close we'd come to a very different outcome, how fragile everything felt. But there was also a strange sense of peace in knowing we'd done something good, something that mattered. The next morning, we packed up and headed home. The camping trip hadn't gone as planned, but as we drove back to the city, I realized it didn't matter. We'd been in the right place at the right time, and that made all the difference. I decided to go camping with my husband, Tom, up at Cedar Island, Minnesota, last summer. Cedar Island is one of those places that feels like stepping back in time. It's remote, rugged, and completely cut off from modern life. To get there, you first have to take a ferry across the bay from the mainland to Cedar Point, and then a smaller boat from Cedar Point to the island itself. Once there, there's no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. Just raw, untouched wilderness. That's exactly what we wanted. A real escape from the grind of daily life. Cedar Island is known for its history. Early settlers lived there, and evidence of their lives is scattered throughout. There are a couple of crumbling old foundations, a handful of small family cemeteries tucked into the woods, and even a trail that used to lead to a long-gone logging mill. The isolation gave it an eerie charm, but we weren't too concerned. We'd camped in plenty of remote places before, and we were used to being alone in the woods. We picked a site close to the shore, with just enough tree cover to give us some shade during the day. It was early August, and the summer heat was still clinging to the air even after the sun went down. The island was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or chirp of a bird settling in for the night. We set up camp quickly, built a fire, and spent the evening listening to the crackling flames and the distant lapping of water against the rocks. Around 10, we noticed how clear the sky was. There wasn't a single cloud, and the stars were scattered across the heavens like someone had spilled a bucket of glitter. We couldn't pass up the opportunity to go stargazing. About a quarter-mile from our campsite was an open field that promised a better view of the sky than we could get under the trees. To reach it, we had to take a narrow path that curved past one of the island's small cemeteries. During the day, the cemetery had seemed unremarkable, just a handful of weathered stones surrounded by a low, crumbling stone wall. At night, though, it took on a different character. The shadows were longer, the air felt cooler, and the thought of those graves lurking just out of sight made me uneasy. We grabbed our flashlights and started down the trail. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light that we didn't need the flashlights at first. The woods around us were still almost unnaturally so. No wind stirred the trees, and even the insects seemed quieter than usual. As we passed the cemetery, a thick fog began to creep in. It started as a light mist curling around our feet, but quickly grew denser, swirling around us like smoke. I tried to tell myself it was normal. This close to the water, fog was bound to roll in at night. But it still felt strange. The way it seemed to rise so suddenly, almost as if it were alive, set my nerves on edge. We kept moving, figuring the field would give us a break from the fog. But halfway there, I noticed something in the distance. Two faint, glowing orbs hovered just above the ground, staring back at us. I froze, my stomach twisting into a knot. The orbs didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared. I nudged Tom and pointed. He saw them too. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the height of the eyes and the way they seemed to shine without any light made me uneasy. Before I could decide what to do, two more sets of eyes appeared, slightly to the left of the first pair, then another to the right. I counted at least 5 sets of glowing eyes, all fixed on us. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. The fog had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. The eyes seemed to float in the mist, disembodied and unnatural. I wanted to run but couldn't bring myself to move. Then one of the figures stepped forward, just enough for the beam of our flashlight to catch it. It was a fox, its coat gleaming silver in the moonlight. The sight should have been a relief, but something about the way it moved, slow, deliberate, felt wrong. Before we could react, the others began to move too. They darted in and out of the fog, circling us. Their glowing eyes never left us, and their movements were eerily coordinated, almost as if they were working together. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted back toward the campsite, not caring if Tom was right behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, and every shadow seemed to lunge toward me as I ran. When we finally reached the safety of our tent, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Tom was right behind me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. We stayed inside the rest of the night, too shaken to even light the fire again. It wasn't until the next morning that we found out Cedar Island was home to a healthy population of foxes. The glowing eyes, the circling, it was just their natural curiosity. But knowing that didn't erase the sheer terror I'd felt in that moment, surrounded by fog and staring into the unknown. We packed up and left a day early. Camping in a place like that might be an adventure for some, but for me, once was enough. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and the way they seemed to pierce right through me. I've always enjoyed camping far away from people. There's something calming about sitting by a fire, staring up at the stars with only trees and mountains around. This time, I picked a spot deep in the mountains, far from any trail. The forest was thick, the kind of place where you feel completely cut off from the world. I set up my tent in a small clearing with a good view of the distant peaks. After eating a quick dinner, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was quiet, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I fell asleep faster than I thought I would. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The forest felt heavy, with no birds or wind. After walking for a while, I came across a dry creek bed filled with pale rocks. It looked like an easy way to wander around without losing my way, so I followed it. About an hour in, I noticed something strange ahead. There was a dark shape off to the side of the creek, partly hidden by bushes. At first, I thought it was just some trash, maybe old clothes. But as I got closer, the smell hit me. A thick, rotten stench like spoiled meat. My stomach churned. It was a body, a man lying face down in the dirt. His arms were stretched out, like he'd been crawling. His clothes were torn and dirty. His skin looked swollen and dark, covered with patches that made him look unreal. Flies buzzed all around him. I couldn't move. My chest tightened, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. There was no blood, no obvious wounds, but the way his body was sprawled, like he'd been desperately reaching for something, made me feel sick. I slowly backed away, careful not to step too loudly on the rocks. My first thought was to call for help, but my phone had no signal out here. My second thought was to leave. Whatever had happened to him, I didn't want to be the next person lying in that creek bed. Walking back to my campsite felt like a nightmare. Every sound made me jump. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, like they were hiding something. I kept turning around, certain I'd see someone, or something, watching me. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was sinking, throwing long, dark shapes across the clearing. I didn't waste time packing. I stuffed my gear into my backpack as fast as I could, not caring if it was organized. I needed to get out before it got completely dark. The hike back to my car was 3 hours, and I couldn't risk staying out here overnight again. As I walked, my thoughts kept circling back to the body. Who was he? How did he end up there, so far from any trail? Had he gotten lost and died alone, or did someone leave him there? The questions made my skin crawl. The hike back felt endless. By the time I reached my car, it was pitch black. The forest around the parking lot was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. I threw my backpack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors as quickly as I could. I started the engine and drove away, headlights cutting through the dark trees. For the next week, I kept checking the news, waiting to hear about a body being found in the mountains. But there was nothing. No search teams, no reports of missing hikers, nothing at all. It was like it never happened. But I know what I saw. Now, every time I think about that trip, I get this sinking feeling in my gut. I can't stop wondering if someone else was out there watching me that day. I didn't hear or see anyone, but the forest was too quiet. It's been months, but I still wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I'm being watched. And the worst part? Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still smell that rotten stench. Clings to me like it followed me home. It was supposed to be a simple weekend with my grandparents in the woods. We went camping far away from the nearest town, in a place so quiet you could hear the wind move through the trees. The weather was just right, and the fire crackled as we settled in for the night. I always enjoyed these trips. It was just the three of us, getting away from the busy world for a while. We put up the tent and gathered sticks for the fire. The only noise came from the crackling of the wood and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The forest felt alive with every sound, but there was something off that night, something I couldn't put my finger on. A weird feeling I couldn't shake. I first noticed it when I went out to grab more firewood. As I walked through the trees, I saw some footprints in the dirt. They didn't look like animal tracks, and they weren't old either. It was like someone had just walked through there. It made me feel uneasy, but I figured it was probably just another camper or hiker who passed by earlier. The feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only got stronger as the night went on. Every little sound, like a twig snapping, felt too loud. Every gust of wind felt like someone was behind me, watching. I kept looking around, half expecting someone to step out from behind the trees. As the fire slowly died down and the night got darker, I went to the tent to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I tried to shut my eyes, it felt like someone was out there, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but the fear just wouldn't go away. Then I heard it. At first, it was so quiet I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. Footsteps, light but steady, crunching on the leaves. My heart started racing. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone walking on purpose. The steps got closer to the tent. I held my breath and stayed still, my body frozen. The footsteps stopped right outside, and I could hear the soft sound of something brushing against the tent. I didn't dare look out. Minutes felt like hours. The footsteps didn't get any closer, but they didn't go away either. I tried to calm my breathing, but it was hard to stay still. My mind kept racing. Then I heard something else. It was like a hand dragging along the side of the tent. I felt my whole body go stiff. Who or what was out there? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was barely glowing now, and there was nothing there. The forest was still and quiet, just like it always was. The footsteps had stopped. I quickly zipped the tent back up and lay down, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I kept listening for any sign of movement, but nothing came. The night dragged on, but eventually, the sun began to rise. I couldn't wait to leave, but as I stepped out of the tent, I froze. There were new footprints all around our campsite. They weren't from animals, these were from a person. And they didn't just stop at the tent. They went around it in a circle, then disappeared into the woods. I didn't say anything to my grandparents, but I knew we had to leave. Fast. We packed up our things in silence and got in the car. As we drove away, I looked back at the woods. My heart skipped a beat. For a second, I thought I saw a figure standing between the trees, watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. That was the last time I ever went camping with my grandparents. It wasn't the fear of ghosts or anything like that. It was the thought that someone, a real person, had been out there in the dark, just watching us. I still don't understand what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure, whoever or whatever it was, they were still out there. And I never want to find out who they were. I'd been driving for hours, trying to get away from everything. I wasn't much of a camper, but I'd always liked the idea of sleeping outside under the stars. I'd heard about a quiet spot, a little graveyard in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep in the woods, far from any town. People said it was peaceful, so I thought it'd be the perfect place to set up camp. I got there right as the sun started to go down. The air was cool, and everything around me seemed so calm. The graveyard wasn't big, just a few old stones with names that were hard to read. It looked ancient, like a place frozen in time. Just what I was looking for. I parked my car on the dirt road and grabbed my camping stuff. As I set up my tent near the edge of the graveyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was quiet, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. After it got dark, I built a small fire and sat beside it, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the night. The firelight flickered across the weathered tombstones, making their shadows look long and creepy. I tried to tell myself it was all fine, that nothing was wrong, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me from the dark. Around midnight, I heard a strange sound, like something scraping on the ground. It came from the far end of the graveyard, way past my camp. At first, I figured it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But this didn't sound like any animal I knew. The scraping stopped for a second, then I heard a soft thud. It echoed through the quiet night, and I could feel my heart start to race. I didn't want to go check it out, but I couldn't help myself. My curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the noise. My boots crunched on the dry leaves as I made my way across the graveyard. I tried not to think about how close I was to the old graves, but it was hard not to. When I reached the far side, the beam of my flashlight landed on something strange. There was a small mound of dirt, like someone had recently dug it up. My stomach dropped. It didn't look old. It looked fresh. Whoever had done this, it hadn't been long ago. I froze. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, but then I noticed something else. A small pile of rocks next to the hole. It wasn't a grave marker. It looked like someone had thrown the rocks together quickly, making a shape that kind of looked like a person, but not quite. I shined my flashlight on it, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was something shiny near the rocks, something metallic. I bent down, my hands shaking. I could barely make it out, but the light caught a piece of jewelry, an old ring, tarnished and worn. My heart thudded louder in my chest. I reached out to grab it, but the moment my fingers brushed against it, the ground under me moved. A low, groaning sound came from the hole, like something was shifting beneath the dirt. I jumped back, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, shot up from the hole. It wasn't fully out yet, but it was enough. The fingers twitched, like they were trying to reach for me. My mind raced, but my body didn't wait for orders. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run before, my feet stumbling over the ground, and I didn't stop until I was back at my camp. I grabbed everything, my gear, my backpack, even the ring, though I didn't want to touch it again. I shoved it all into my car in a panic, not even stopping to think. As I started the engine and sped off, I didn't look back until I was halfway down the road. When I did, the only thing I saw was the dark woods, the graveyard behind me, hidden in the shadows. I told myself I wouldn't go back. Couldn't. But something about that night stuck with me. The feeling of those eyes, or whatever it was, watching me. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been digging, whoever had left that ring behind, was still out there. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something, just for a second, moving in the darkness. The shape of a figure, standing at the edge of the graveyard, watching me leave. I never did find out who had been digging or why they left that ring. But I'll tell you this, I don't know what was buried there, and I don't think I want to know. What I do know is that I'll never go near that graveyard again. The woods have a way of hiding things you're better off not finding. It was a Friday evening when my boss told us that our meeting was going to be outdoors instead of in the usual conference room. He thought it'd be good to get away from the office and bond by camping at a spot by the lake. I wasn't excited about it at all. I'd rather be at home with my couch and TV. But the rest of the team seemed fine with it, so I went along. We piled into the company vans, and after about an hour's drive, we reached the camp. Mr. Collins, our general manager, gave everyone jobs, setting up tents, getting a fire going, and cooking. He seemed really into the whole camping thing, smiling and telling us to join in. I did my part, but I wasn't exactly excited. As the sun started to set, we all sat around the fire. There was some laughter and talking, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. The lake, which usually looked peaceful, now seemed dark and scary in the fading light. I noticed Mr. Collins wasn't as cheerful anymore. He stared at the water, his smile gone. Later that night, around midnight, when everyone else was asleep in their tents, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing strange rustling noises from the trees behind us. I looked around but couldn't see anything. The noises kept going, getting louder and more purposeful. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but it didn't sound like it. It sounded like someone was moving around, someone trying to be quiet. I slowly stood up and walked away from the fire, trying to see through the trees, but it was too dark. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine. The rustling was getting closer, and I started hearing soft, low whispers that I couldn't make out. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the camp, putting out the fire. It was pitch dark. Couldn't see a thing. The rustling stopped, and everything went completely quiet. I stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of the silence press down on me. My heart was racing. I wanted to run, but I didn't want to panic and wake everyone up. I stood still, hoping whatever it was would just go away. After what felt like forever, I finally moved, slowly, back to my tent. I zipped it up tight and lay there, trying to ignore the sound of footsteps outside, just beyond the light of the campfire. The next morning, when the sun came up, Mr. Collins called everyone together. He seemed on edge, glancing around like he was expecting something to jump out at him. The whole camp felt tense, and no one spoke much. We packed up quickly and left without saying a word about the night. But I could tell everyone was freaked out. As we drove back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't just my imagination. Something or someone was out there watching us. The way the air felt thick, the way the trees seemed to shift in the dark, like they were hiding something, couldn't get rid of it. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing. But as we neared the city, I caught something in the corner of my eye. It was only for a second, but I swear I saw someone standing by the side of the road, tall, shadowy, unmoving, and just before I turned my head to look at it directly, it disappeared. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something was still out there, and whatever it was, it wasn't done with us yet. I was out in the woods, leading a small group of new recruits on their first overnight camping trip. It was just another routine for me, something I'd done many times before. The sun had just gone down, and the campfire was the only source of light. The recruits were busy setting up their tents and getting ready for the night. But there was something off about the place. It was that feeling you get down your spine, like you're being watched, but you can't figure out why. The woods were too quiet, too still. There weren't any birds, no rustling leaves. It was like nature itself had gone silent. I tried to convince myself it was just the night settling in, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up in me. I did my usual check around the camp, walking the perimeter like I always do. But this time, every step felt louder than it should. The beam from my flashlight flickered, casting long shadows, and I had to tap it against my hand to get it working again. The deeper I walked into the woods, the more I felt like someone was watching me. My training told me to ignore it, to keep moving and stay focused. But it wasn't that easy. There was something wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. When I got back to the camp, the recruits were all inside their tents, settling down. I sat by the fire, trying to brush off the feeling, but then I heard it. There was something moving in the woods, slow, deliberate steps. It sounded like it was circling the camp. My heart started racing. I grabbed my rifle and stood, staring into the dark trees, trying to see anything. I could hear it clearly now. Twigs snapping and leaves crunching underfoot, just beyond the light of the fire. I was alone, and the recruits were tucked deep in their tents, so they wouldn't hear a thing. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe an animal? A bear or something? But this didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was too slow, too controlled. And then the wind picked up, shaking the trees, and everything went quiet. No more sounds. I didn't hesitate. I moved quietly back to the edge of camp, scanning the woods again. The trees felt like they stretched on forever, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the fire's glow. And then, for a split second, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, too deliberate. I couldn't make sense of it, but I didn't have time to think. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to focus, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the figure was heading straight for the recruits' tents. Panic hit me hard, and I ran back to camp as fast as I could, my boots pounding on the dirt. I reached the tents, and for a moment, I just stood there, catching my breath. Everything seemed fine, no one was stirring. They were all asleep, completely unaware. I sat up the rest of the night, eyes locked on the trees. Whatever it was, it didn't come closer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. When the sun came up, I felt a rush of relief, but I was drained, exhausted. I quickly told the recruits to pack up and leave. We left that spot earlier than planned, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel that something was still following us, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, hidden in the shadows. I never went back to that campsite, and I can't explain it, but every time I step into the woods now, there's this feeling, like something's watching me from just out of sight. It's always there, just on the edge of my vision, waiting.